All right, class, this lecture is about the divine call to resistance, black angels and white angels, part 2. Let's talk about some specific people, some names. Last time we talked about the Maroons, and we mentioned David Walker, Denmark Vesey, Gabriel Prosser, Nat Turner, um, and Toussaint Louverture, and all the sisters and brothers from Haiti, late 1790s, early 1800s. Let's talk about some others who picked up this banner or this notion that there is a divine call. Like there were people who believed that if you're a Christian, you are supposed to answer the call of your time, the challenge of your time. And the challenge of these folks' time were black people being um, enslaved, or even after enslavement, black people being um, oppressed, treated like second-class citizens, and they believed that it was a divine obligation. I can't stress that enough, um, because one of the things that black folk were taught in church was, leave these earthly matters. That's not your concern. Your concern is getting your soul right with God, so that once you die, you will receive your reward in heaven. So this notion of worrying about or dealing with issues, challenges, problems in life on this side of the grave, um, the notion of dealing with that, African people were taught that that's evil, that's satanic, that's wasting time, that's taking time away from where you should be focused, which is worrying about what's going to happen to your soul after you die. And that same line of thinking um, is still very, very prevalent in the black church in general. Not every black church, of course, but let's talk about some names that you need to remember. Uh, One name is Edward Wilmot Blyden. Edward Wilmot, Wilmot, Blyden, Blyden. Edward Wilmot Blyden um, is celebrated way more outside of the United States than he is inside, and that's a shame. He was known as the father of Pan-Africanism. Edward Wilmot Blyden, like any human being, wanted to uh, fully actualize his potential. Very bright young man, wanted to go to school, got accepted into college. When he got there, they find out, oh, yo, he's black. You can't let him in. And he had just many life experiences like that, but he eventually found his way to Sierra Leone. Um, and there he created a legendary and iconic career for himself, multifaceted career. He was a college professor. He was about 5 or 6 other things. He became a high-ranking official in the Sierra Leone government, and just wildly popular. So much so that he ran for president. Barely lost, but his popularity, he believed, was a problem, especially since the election was so close. He feared for his life, felt that his popularity would kind of mess with the dude that won the election. So Edward Wilmot Blyden left Sierra Leone and he went to uh, Liberia, and there he uh, founded a career that was even greater than the one he founded in Sierra Leone. But what made Blyden a Pan-Africanist was, all while he's doing this work in Africa, he's challenging African sisters and brothers about the choices of the names that they are taking and giving their children, the choice of clothing, etc., because they were mimicking Europeans. And he was like, you are African, you should be proud. And so here is this black man originally born in the West Indies, but grew up in the United States, going to Africa and teaching and opening the eyes of a lot of sisters and brothers from the continent to their own history of giving the world religion, art, science, civilization, etc. Um, and so in stressing, celebrating their Africanness and their history and culture rather than trying to run away from it. So uh, that's one of the reasons why he's considered Pan-Africanist. The other is because he never stopped going back to the United States and trying to divorce African American minds of this notion that black folk from the continent are all savage and ignorant and know absolutely nothing and are heathen, etc., etc. And he's trying to wake people up, in black folk up in the United States, of the history and the beauty and the connection of African people everywhere. But while he's living in Africa, he's trying to do the same thing, wake African people up to their connection to their sisters and brothers in the States and the islands, and to their own history. And for all of those efforts, which inspired many of his contemporaries, some of which I will be mentioning in this video, for those reasons, Edward Wilmot Blyden is considered the father of Pan-Africanism. The notion that black folk, wherever you are, we have a common ancestry, common issues, common challenges, and we can do more together than we can apart. So that's Edward Wilmot Blyden. And so much of what he did was, again, just like Nat Turner, Denmark Vesey, Gabriel Prosser, it was inspired by his faith. And of the many things he was a minister as well, preaching the gospel, but also preaching a gospel of liberation. Edward Wilmot Blyden. Okay, so who else? Bishop Henry McNeil Turner. And he was the first everything. He was like the first black chaplain in the United States Army, the first black postmaster general of, I think, the state of Georgia or something like that. He was an AME minister, pastor, and he had this idea that black people in the United States should become missionaries and go to Africa, go to the backwards dark continent, and Christianize these heathen Africans. That was his idea before he took about 3 or 4 trips to the continent. After taking those trips, he realized just how misinformed he had been about his own sisters and brothers from the continent. He recognized that, all the things that he had been taught about Africa being backwards and etc., etc., he realized just how messed up his own education and perceptions had been. And so, AME minister, a brother on the front lines in many different facets of life, and a really popular leader in the AME church. So much so, he was asked to address the National Baptist Convention, which was one of the largest black organizations in the country. But there, and I don't remember the exact date, dadgummit, I don't have my book This Far by Faith to read the exact quote that he, wait a minute, do I have my book? Sorry about that, class. I do have my book, This Far by Faith. There are books everywhere. Yeah, so here he is at the National Baptist Convention. Oh, this is not from the National Baptist Convention, but this is something he wrote in 1898. Every race of people since time began who have attempted to describe their God by words or by paintings or by carvings or by other form or figure have conveyed the image that the God who made them and shaped their destinies was symbolized in themselves. And why should not the Negro believe that he resembles God as much so as other people? We do not believe there is any hope for a race of people who do not believe they look like God. So this is what he wrote after the fact, where he's really, I guess, kind of talking about the words that he gave at that National Baptist Convention, where he shocked the world. Basically, he said, whites have the sense to depict God in their own image. Asians have the sense, the spiritual sense, to depict God in their own image, black folks should do the same. And that's when he said, that's when he declared that God is a Negro. That black folk have to have the nerve to be able to see God in their own image. Not that they believe God was some big man in the sky, but if you're going to have pictures of God and describe God, and have images of God and all those who are holy in your house, whatever, that you are doing a disservice to your own spiritual consciousness, your own mental faculties, if you picture the divine looking something different than you. Every other people had the common sense to picture the divine looking like them except black people, and that's what Bishop Henry McNeill Turner, that's one of the reasons why he is considered, that's one of the reasons why he's celebrated. You know, he did many other things, but that's one of the things. So that's Bishop Henry McNeill Turner. You also have Henry Highland Garnett, um, who was a contemporary and real good friends with another famous person in African-American history, Alexander Crummell, and a few other people. But Henry Highland Garnett, just like Edward Wilmot Blyton, just like Martin Delany, who I may have time to talk about or not. Yeah, I have all these young people, and like I said, any human being, whatever gender, whatever race, we all have this inner drive to become fully actualized, to become our best self, to grow and expand and create and, you know, give our best to the world. And so these young men had that same drive. They all wanted to go to school, and all of them um, were accepted at universities. And then, you know, when they get on campus, folk find out, Lord have mercy, they're black, and folk lose their mind. But Henry Highland Garnett, after going through that same experience, was accepted to a university that existed for the specific purpose of providing education for young brothers and sisters. I don't know, young brothers at that particular time. I don't know, but young black men who wanted to become educated. So Henry Highland Garnett gets there. The people in the neighboring town are not too keen on a school that's educating black folk, and so they run him out of town. But Henry Highland Garnett, again, being led by his religious convictions, became part of the abolitionist movement, but then he became part of the, oh gosh, how on earth am I forgetting this term? Um, the, the colonization movement. And that's a movement that not a lot of people just realized was in existence, but there were a lot of black folk um, during the late 1800s, early 1900s, who believed that they had done everything humanly possible to become a part of American society. Um, they had tried to dress the part. They had tried to educate themselves into the part. They had tried to speak with a certain diction and properness in order to be accepted. Um, Others had tried other means, and they believed that they had banged their head against the wall so many times that there was no wall left to bang, or there was no head left to bang. And so you had a movement of people who believed that the only way black people were going to find any kind of life worth living is if we did a voluntary colonization, move back to Africa or somewhere outside of the United States, because it wasn't happening for black people here. Henry Highland Garnett moved to that position, and he was an advocate for colonization. And it wasn't like the vast majority of black folk in this country were never part of that movement, because there was always black folk that said, you know, we've given too much blood, sweat, and tears to build up this country. This country is as much ours, if not more so ours, than anybody else, because everything that has become the riches that has allowed the United States to become a world power, and Europe, we generated that. So why should we leave? We're leaving our own legacy, the thing that we built ourselves. Literally, we built ourselves. But even with that said, you had brothers like Henry Highland Garnet and others that said that may be true, but we cannot find equality here. We will not be treated as if Black Lives Matter. Hence, we need to get the hell out of Dodge. And so he was a part of that movement, but his efforts fell through. But the thing to remember about Henry Highland Garnet was he in his lifetime echoed the words of David Walker. Basically, blacks need to get their freedom by any means necessary. There's one other thing I wanted to say about my man Henry Highland Garnet, and he had a legendary career during the Civil War. But yeah, and he started the African Civilization Society in 1859. He explained his particular views in a speech in 1860. And he said, "We believe that Africa is to be redeemed by Christian civilization, and that the great work is to be chiefly achieved by the free and voluntary immigration of enterprising colored people." So he kind of like Bishop Henry McNeil Turner believed that it was black folks' Christian duty to go back and work with their sisters and brothers in Africa, and that was the only place that they were going to find, a life where they could be self-respecting. Because of his stance, a lot of the people that were in the abolition movement kind of turned on Henry Highland Garnet. Folk like Frederick Douglass and others who were his contemporaries when he was a part of the abolition movement. But that's Henry Highland Garnet, sounding a whole lot like David Walker. And there was Martin Delany, who did his thing in Pennsylvania. He has a very similar story, but all these persons are highly religious people being led to create a new existence for black people out of their religious convictions, not out of their educational or socioeconomic or political convictions, but out of their religious convictions, out of this divine call. In their minds, it was a divine call to resistance. Probably one of the most well-known yet underappreciated in terms of his religious connections is Marcus Mosiah Garvey. And if you haven't read this book, shame on you. You need to check it out. The Philosophy and Opinions of Marcus Garvey. Great book. Great book. But I'm giving you these names because when we talk about the divine call to resistance, in my mind, one of the first things I think about is black liberation theology. For most people, haven't even heard the term before, although it's been in existence since the 1960s. And people credit Reverend Albert B. Cleage Jr., who's considered the father of black theology or black liberation theology. He wrote best-selling book 1967, 1968, The Black Messiah, translated into 40-something different languages, inspired folk all over the planet. When Nelson Mandela and Walter Sisulu and others were on jailed in Robben Island, one of their contemporaries that was in jail with him, his name was Strenny Moodley, who just died a few years ago. He said that one of the things that allowed them to maintain hope in a hopeless situation was they would read a smuggled in copy of The Black Messiah. They would read that by candlelight at night, and it gave them little something to hold on to. So Reverend Albert B. Cleage, this brother right here, wrote Black Messiah published in 1967, and Black Christian Nationalism, New Directions for the Black Church. This one was published in 1972. But when we're talking about the term Black liberation theology, in most people's minds, either Reverend Albert B. Cleage or Professor James Cone comes to mind. Professor James Cone, who is still alive and well, doing great work. I forget what institution he is teaching out of right now, but they trace the origins of that term and that way of thinking to the 1960s. But that way of thinking, when you research history, goes way back to the people that we talked about in the first video and the folk we're talking about now. So it did not just emerge during the 1960s. It was there with Edward Wilmot Blyden, with Bishop Henry McNeil Turner, Martin Delany, Henry Highland Garnett, Denmark Vesey, Gabriel Prosser, Nat Turner, David Walker, and many other folks who don't even have time to mention. But before we get to Cleage and James Cone, I just want to say a quick word about Marcus Garvey. When I was in seminary at Candler School of Theology, Emory University, it just struck me that, you know, people of all racial and ethnic backgrounds have been religious and have practiced religion for eons. And one of the things that, you know, everyone says about black folk is just how spiritual black folk are, how religious black folk are. Yet here I am in an institution studying religion, and all of the theologians that we are studying are dead European white men. I'm like, okay, so how are all the authorities on religion just these dead European white men? What makes one guy an authority and a theologian, and some other person just some dude or some woman with an opinion? And my professors told me, well, a theologian is someone who has documented evidence of their beliefs, what they believe about God, religion, salvation, and the role of the church. But by that definition, most of the people that we were studying would not cut the mustard, because they did not have that documented evidence of their beliefs. They didn't document it themselves. Folk after them documented what they believed. And now, so anyone, whatever seminary you go to, you will study particular names. I don't even have to go through those names because they get all the press. But by the definition that my professors gave me about what makes one person a theologian and another person just some homie with an opinion, the person that fits the bill the best is actually Marcus Garvey. In Philosophy and Opinions of Marcus Garvey, and this is just one book, but many, many other books, he lays out specifically what he believes about God, salvation, humanity, and the role of religion / the church. Specifically, and his organization, the UNIA, the Universal Negro Improvement Association, it was run like a church. It held its meetings on Sundays. It had a lecture or a speech every Sunday, which was in tune with a sermon. They had the whole singing and et cetera, going on. If you joined the UNIA, you were baptized into the movement. And if you're a part of that movement, you would take catechism classes, similar to the catechism classes in the Catholic Church. So everything about it had the trappings of a religious experience, because Marcus Garvey was an extremely religious man. He was a Christian, a devout Christian. However, he did not want any one particular church to become the official church of the UNIA, because he recognized that black folk practiced Christianity, Hinduism, Buddhism, Islam, many different traditional African faiths, and he was trying to appeal to a Pan-African world, black people everywhere. And he felt like if he made one particular church the official church of the UNIA, it would be closing the door on millions of black people who would be a part of his movement. So on one level, the move made sense. One person who was working very closely with Marcus Garvey was Bishop George Alexander McGuire, who founded the African Orthodox Church. Many people assume that Garvey founded the African Orthodox Church because it was so closely tied to the UNIA. Bishop George Alexander McGuire wanted to make the African Orthodox Church the official church of the UNIA, but Garvey nixed that idea. But Garvey, in terms of his belief system, he believed that God created all human beings equal. And so in his mind, not only in his mind, in his words, he said, if you find yourself, he's talking to black people, he's talking to everyone, if you find yourself in a situation where you are being treated less than, where you are being oppressed, exploited, whatever, don't blame God, don't blame the government, don't blame the white man. We know that white, you know, I'm speaking for Garvey now, we know that whites have oppressed and exploited black people, but don't blame them for your situation, because if we really believe that God created you and everybody equal, then you believe that you have the same intelligence and ability and creativity to create the kind of world that you say that you want. So go out there and build it. That was Garvey's belief system, and he believed that that's what God wanted, and he lifted up. I mean, always quoting scripture and the Bible and holding up Jesus as the example of, you know, the revolutionary par excellence, so to speak. But that was Garvey, and it's interesting because Garvey's take on how God looked upon black folk who were suffering was so totally different than the way James Cone looked upon it. Garvey looked upon it as God created us all equal. It's on us. God is the God of all of us, but it's on us. We've got to do our part. We can't just cry and whine and expect God to do it, or cry and whine and expect white folk to do it, or cry and whine and expect the government to do it. That's different than Cone, because one of his most famous books, most famous writings, is entitled God of the Oppressed. And the foundational idea behind that is God is on the side of the oppressed. So God has like this special relationship with those who find themselves in an oppressive situation. God will look out for you. God will do things for you because you're oppressed. Garvey said that's BS. God is, if you are oppressed, God is more pissed at you than God is at those people who are mistreating you. God made you equal to everyone else. Stand up and change your conditions. So there were two different ways of viewing God and God's call to black folk, but Garvey and later on Cone, but they were still talking about a divine call to resistance, that this is not just a political thing, not just an educational, social, economic thing. This is a religious thing, a religious movement. So that's Garvey. But like I said, in the 60s with Albert B. Cleage Jr. and James Cone, that's when this whole idea of black liberation theology kind of came to the forefront. Reverend Albert B. Cleage, we'll be talking about him in depth a little later, but Cleage was like almost in lockstep with the teachings of Marcus Garvey. The book Princes Shall Come Out of Egypt talks about that. Do you have a copy back here? I thought I had my copy behind me of Princes Shall Come Out of Egypt. But anyway, the book Princes Shall Come Out of Egypt is a comparison of Marcus Garvey's theological and ecclesiological positions with those of Reverend Albert B. Cleage Jr. They agreed on so much, but the one place that they disagreed was the place of the church in the movement. Like I said, Garvey felt that making one church, the official church of the UNIA, would take away from his movement. Cleage believed that the church was the only institution that black folk owned and controlled, and if you had all kinds of people with all kinds of different beliefs, that would take away from the opportunity for real unity and power and the ability to work together. And you know, you could say the jury is out on which way was right, but Garvey himself would complain that, even though he built an organization that had 6 million people all over the world, he would go to one city or one country and he would speak. And he said in his book, Philosophy and Opinions, I'm there, and 5 minutes later, after I leave, folk are disobeying my orders. They're not following. There was no real unity. Folk, were all saying amen to this notion of freedom, but no one was willing to work together organizationally. So that kind of speaks to, um, I guess, the wisdom of Klieg's approach, that you've got to have people that have some common ground of belief. Even though you want to appeal to everyone, you got to have some common ground of belief if you're going to be any kind of level of successful. You may have size and people everywhere, but if you don't have organization and the ability to get anything done, it's not going to last. Garvey's career was not long. His influence, however, was incredible. Um, uh, Malcolm Little, who later became Malcolm X, who later became El-Hajj Malik El-Shabazz, his parents were Garveyites. His father was killed because he was a preacher preaching Garvey's message of black people, up ye mighty race, Africa for the Africans, up ye mighty race, accomplish what you will. Robert Elijah Poole, who later became the head of the Nation of Islam, he had been a Garveyite. Noble Drew Ali, who founded the Moorish Science Temple out of Newark, New Jersey, he and his organization was influenced heavily by Marcus Garvey and the UNIA. The Rastafarian movement hold up Marcus Garvey as a patron saint. The African liberation movement that swept across the African continent in the 1960s and 70s, where you had African nations that were standing up against their colonial oppressors and running them out of their countries. Every leader of every one of those movements, whether you're talking about Dedan Kimathi or Jomo Kenyatta or Julius Nyerere or Kwame Nkrumah, they all point back to being inspired by the words of Marcus Mosiah Garvey. So Garvey's influence was and still is actually pretty darn incredible. Impacted directly Malcolm X, impacted directly the Black Panthers, and impacted directly the church that Albert B. Klieg Jr. Founded, the Shrines of the Black Madonna. So, but Garvey's political career in the United States was not long at all. It was really, in some ways, less than 10 years, and then he was deported on trumped-up charges, but he was deported in the late 20s and not let back into the country after that. His work continued in Canada and in other places, but he died in 1940, never coming back into the United States. But whether we're talking about Marcus Garvey or Albert B. Klieg or James Cone, or we're going back in the day with Edward Wilmot Blyden, Toussaint Louverture, we're talking about a divine call to resistance. And with Klieg and Cone and other black theologians or black liberation theologians, they point even further back. They point to biblical days, and they use the scripture Luke 4, where Jesus walks into the temple and he opens up the scroll of Isaiah and he reads the words, the Spirit of the Lord is upon me, to preach good news to the poor, liberation for those in chains, recovery of sight to the blind, and the year of the Lord's favor, or the year Jubilee. And they point to that, liberation theologians point to that, because black liberation theologians say that the focus of the faith should not be on what's going to happen to you after you die, but rather changing conditions on this side of the grave. In that particular scripture where Jesus is letting the world know what his ministry and mission is all about, everything in those words is about changing conditions on this side of the grave. There's absolutely nothing in that particular scripture where Jesus is talking about what you need to do to get your life, your spirit, your soul together for after you die. The Spirit of the Lord is upon me to preach good news to the poor, recovery of sight to the blind, liberation for those in chains. Everything is about making life better here, dealing with the challenges of life right here. And so black liberation theologians, they point to those scriptures, and they point to the Old Testament over and over and over and over and over again, the people of God being in bondage and calling upon God to help them, and God responding in one way or another, whether God sends somebody, a Moses or a Jael or someone else to be the leader and push the people, or God doing miraculous acts like holding the sun back so that the people can organize, or giving them manna from heaven when they're hungry, or water from a rock when they're thirsty. But black liberation theologians point to all those references in the Bible of God, this divine call to move out of a situation that is untenable, where you are being oppressed, where you're being disrespected, where you are being treated as if your life does not matter. That is the divine call to resistance. That's it. We've talked. I did not mean to go for 36 minutes and 15 seconds, so that's it.